If you try to understand the opponent, I'm told that one is legitimizing it. And this is partly true, which is why it's a powerful argument. If you're explaining what the other side is doing, then at some level you are legitimizing it. But this should be allowed to some extent, because again, the most basic instinct in human nature is to organize in groups and for security. And if you want to reduce the security competition, you have to show understanding for the opponent. Meanwhile, our basic human nature is telling us the opposite. It's we see an external threat, we have to rally against it. And this is, it's also, I think, important, perhaps, knowledge about how propaganda actually works then, because this is what's exploited. Propaganda implies you're convincing people or trying to convince an audience by appealing to the instinctive in humanity. And the main instinct is group identity. And this is where propaganda comes from. And the main argument is, you as an individual can be full of reason, but once the group psychology kicks in, this overrides reason. It's always us versus them. This is very instinctive in humanity. All you have to do is manipulate the stereotypes. If we are good, the other side is evil, suddenly reality doesn't matter anymore. This is why it's so powerful, and we often look towards other countries who say, if they invade a country, they do it for imperialism, their barbarism. If we do the exact same thing, it's to spread the freedom, democracy, human rights. And it's not difficult to understand why. You would like to have support from the public towards a certain policy. But as we see time and time again, when you refer to the adversary as evil, it's great if you want to mobilize for conflict. If you see someone you have to defeat, explain to the public, we're good, they're evil. Through this prism, people are willing to use their resources, even sacrifice their own lives. But once there's time for peace, to have a workable peace, we dismiss it altogether, because nobody wants peace with evil, with the enemy. So this is the danger of propaganda. Great for war, terrible for peace. And so yeah, I think we need to get out of this fear spiral. I think that's the main objective. We started to set up these ideas of fact checkers. It's become a very common thing. And who doesn't want facts to be checked? And I think they're responding to a real problem. There's a lot of lying going around, a lot of disinformation. So it's a real issue, but outsourcing this work to some NGO, which is very ideological, government financed. And case in point, I wrote a lot about the current proxy war between NATO and Russia. And if I address the toppling of the Ukrainian president in 2014, you can go on the EU's disinformation website, and they said, well, if you call it a coup, it's a disinformation and pushed by the Russians. And if you repeat it, then you might be working for the Russians. So now you're an enemy of the people, effectively. But that's not a fact checking. That's a narrative check. You can check facts, and you can, for example, look, well, what's objective reality? Well, for example, he was recognized to be democratically elected by the OSCE. That's a fact. You can look, did the removal of him breach the constitution of Ukraine? Yes, it did. You can fact check this. Did it have a majority support among Ukrainians? No, it didn't. The BBC, everyone did polling. So you can check the facts, but the facts is not what the government likes, because we want to sell this as a democratic revolution, not as a coup. So we have narrative checks. So once you empower the government to monopolize on truth and have a ministry of truth, if you will, then of course they're going to abuse it. They're fallible. They're human beings. They're not going to give up on their own interests in order to live by some principles. What I argue is, for example, that the decision to begin to expand NATO in the 90s, that this would be devastating for Europe. We would re-divide the continent, we would remilitarize it, and by moving these dividing lines closer and closer to Russian borders, we would have ultimately war. This was my PhD thesis as well. It finished actually in 2014, and that was my conclusion. We're going to have war over where to draw the new dividing lines. So Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, all the countries where we're now battling for dominance effectively. Can I prove it? And I said, of course I can. Bill Clinton himself pointed out this might recreate a Cold War. It's his U.S. Secretary of Defense, George Kennan, more than 50 of these leading American military leaders and politicians who all said the same thing. This in the 90s, this is going to create a huge problem. It's not in our interest if we're going to end up in a conflict with the Russians. And this is the argument I serve. But all they hear is, well, now you're blaming us for the war and you're excusing what Russia did. So now you're picking the wrong side. You're anti-Western, conservative, propaganda, conspiracy theorists. They can throw all these words around, which doesn't mean much, but all it means is effectively you went against the in-group and you are now supporting the out-group. I think it's all nonsense, but this is what happens in war. You're expected to not necessarily observe objective reality, but you should show group loyalty, irrespective of going against your own national interests. The Russians and Ukrainians, they negotiated in early 2022. Actually, when the Russians invaded, Zelensky confirms on the first day after the invasion that the Russians contacted them for peace. But the only thing the Russians really wanted was to speak about neutrality. The next day, Zelensky confirmed it again. It's on the Ukrainian websites. On the third day, the Ukrainians and Russians agreed they would start negotiations. And this was because they saw that the Americans and British, as well as the Europeans, had sabotaged the Minsk peace agreement for 7 years. Once this happened, the Russians invaded, and on the first day they used their force in order to pressure an agreement on the Ukrainians, mainly neutrality. And if you saw on the same side, on the American side, they said no, they would not accept any diplomacy, any negotiations. Russians had to withdraw first. That was a precondition. The Ukrainians said no, we don't need preconditions, we can start negotiations now. And then when the American spokesperson, Ned Price, was argued, will you support the Ukrainians' negotiations because they're starting it with Russia? He said, no, this is bigger than Russia and Ukraine. We have our own interest. So this is when we found out that the Americans and British went in and they sabotaged the peace agreement. Everyone, the Israeli, Turkish negotiators, half the people on the Ukrainian side confirms it. They all said the same thing. The Russians wanted one thing. They wanted NATO out of Ukraine, and neutrality was the most important thing. Everything else they would negotiate and make compromise and even abandon their demands. And as the Israeli Prime Minister and the Turkish Foreign Minister said, again, the two negotiators, they said the same thing. The British and Americans, they saw an opportunity to kill Russians, weaken a strategic rival, and essentially do it with Ukrainians. So this was an opportunity, and they took it. And as other officials said, the main objective should now be regime change in Russia. So they took advantage of it. It was an opportunity to fight a war. And it's more or less objective reality. This can be proven. But it's also clearly not in our interest. You have hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians. You're having Europe marching towards nuclear war. This is a horrific development. So it's true, it's not in our interest. But if you comment on it, what do they hear? Oh, well, now you're taking Russia's side because you're excusing them and you're blaming us. So again, the group loyalty comes first. And an even more different case, which can't really be dismissed, is the whole Nord Stream. I mean, when they blew up these pipelines, again, let's be honest, most likely the Americans, they said right away, oh, it was the Russians, it was the Russians. And what did they do? They used this as a reason to escalate the war in Ukraine, send heavier and more weapons, and also NATO had to begin to militarize more the Baltic Sea and the oceans. Well, then, after the narrative fell apart, the Americans admitted, okay, it wasn't the Russians. Actually, we knew that it was the Ukrainians. Zelensky ordered it, but we tried to stop him. And we knew this before the attack even occurred. I find this to be nonsense, but it's an interesting admission, because what they're admitting now is, yes, we lied to our public, we lied to the world, and we used that lie in order to escalate the war and to militarize the Baltic Sea. Well, it seems like we've been on a trajectory of fear for at least a decade now. We can be rational, free-thinking individuals, but once we feel these fears, what do? There's full conformity, we stop questioning government. And look what happened back in 2016. This is, for me, this is when a lot of these problems began. They noticed that Trump was winning could win the election, I think it was back in June of 2016, the head of the CIA, he had a talk with Obama. He said that, you know, Clinton's planning to fabricate ties between, you know, Trump and the Russians. So this is a huge, the Russians are taking the White House effectively. And, you know, so they created this Russiagate story. And afterwards, it was proven that, yeah, there was Clinton who paid for the Steele dossier, all the arguments about, you know, secret servers and, you know, all of this was proven to be fake. It was a fake story. But it's powerful, because if you can link the political opposition to one of your main enemies, which is Russia, then, yeah, you can delegitimize him. This was seen as the, actually within the Clinton camp, this was also written, this was seen as the main election strategy. The problem is you fuel a lot of hate and a lot of fear. And obviously within America, they were willing to, any problems they had with the Democrats, they're willing to ignore all of it, because when you really hate the opposition, you excuse everything that your own party does. You always have to be afraid of something, because nothing produces group loyalty like this. Again, it's not an accident that propaganda began to be more utilized about 100 years ago. Society was becoming more and more complex, and you know, throughout the day you would have to interpret 1,000 different things as you go along. This is why we have mental shortcuts. Now you do the same in political propaganda. You create political mental shortcuts. So, and our main mental shortcut in terms of explaining the world as us and them, as good versus evil, is usually everything is liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Everything is, you know, our freedom versus the next Hitler. So this is how it's done. So we can hear, oh, there's a war, America's bombing Yemen. Well, why is that? Oh, well, they're terrorists. We want democracy. Okay, so this is the only filter you need to interpret the reality. And the more complex the world is, the more people rely on these filters, because you can't know everything about everything. So, but nonetheless, as soon as a war breaks out with a country they have never heard of, can't find it on a map, they nonetheless on the first day know exactly how they should feel about it. And how can you explain this? Well, you don't need reason, you don't need the knowledge, or you just manipulate these mental shortcuts. You assign the right stereotypes, and yeah, objective reality, it's not really that important anymore. And just explain why you have to fear them, why their intentions are evil, why ours is good. And I think this goes with everything. If you want control, just incite a lot of fear into people, and then you have the solutions. Just do as you're told, and we will help you. And this is usually how it goes. You have to fight the good fight. And so if you believe that, well, let's say politics, that one side is good, one is evil, you're morally compelled to do what's right. So fight the good fight rather than report on reality. So you can, you don't need a lot of conspiracies in back rooms. All you need is for people to subscribe to these stereotypes. I mean, look at the British now. They're quite comfortable to send police on your door if you retweeted the wrong thing. They actually say that retweets can get you arrested. And you being nearby protests, which they don't approve of, this is also enough to get you arrested. So they have there's a lot of strange things happening. But this doesn't stop the British from, if they're going to complain about freedom of assembly or freedom of speech in China or anywhere else, no, they still feel very comfortable. They still hold on to this identity that they are for freedom. All the main digital platforms, all the main economic developments leads to more and more concentration of power. So I think there is a trend towards increasing authoritarianism. So we are pushing for reducing individual freedoms. And it is true, sadly, if you want to do this, you have to keep the population somewhat fearful. You know, I think it's a very dangerous direction we're going. For the past 5 centuries, we always had a very Western-centric international system. We now have the emergence of multipolarity, so the rise of Asia, China. You know, how this could be a tremendous, exciting opportunity. We have the Chinese rising, here we have the Europeans on the other side of this great Eurasian continent. We could have infrastructure, technology cooperation, we could cultural exchange. There's so many things that could be positive, but there's huge power shifts involved. So you turn up the fear very quickly and explain, well, they want to dominate us. So now all this economic competition, we're militarizing all of it. And now we're going to start to join the Americans in terms of going after the Chinese, while we're going after the Russians, the Iranians, and anyone else challenging the power. So I think there could be a tremendous amount of opportunities if we would have a rational discussion about the other side, because if we don't understand them, there's always going to be fear which dictates how we interpret their interests and their motivations. And it's I think for me this is the main part that drives the fear, that if you can't understand it, then fear will take over. Again, if your opponent isn't acting out of security concerns himself, his own interest, if every political military action they take comes from, in a vacuum, from a place of evil where they want to dominate and dictate you, the main outcome will always be fear. It will always be that they're coming for you, and this is when we retreat into the tribal mentality and we prepare for effectively war, which is crazy, but we're not very self-reflective. Keep in mind that 30 years ago, the main policy of the Chinese as well as the Russians were to get as close as possible to the West. This was the main goal. Now they're working very hard in order to decouple from us, to become as little exposed as possible. And the reason is we think they're evil and we want to destroy them. We've done a lot of mistakes, but if you can't criticize your own kind, your own in-group, how can you possibly resolve these problems? And so I think we're just digging a hole deeper and deeper by the day. So it's ironically, I'm spreading a lot of fear here, but I see this as it has to be, if the fear is the main problem, the solution really has to be to reduce it. And the way to reduce it is to have an honest discussion about the other side. What are their motivations? Because it's not to commit evil, as we keep saying.